An evaluation of risks, benefits, and alternative methods for pursuing open source objectives. Elizabeth Seger, Noemi Drexler, Richard Melange, Emily Dardeman, Jonah Schuett, Kay Wei, open sourcing highly capable foundation models. An evaluation of risks, benefits, and alternative methods for pursuing open source objectives. Elizabeth Seger 1-2, Noemi Drexler. Recent decisions by leading AI labs to either open source their models or to restrict access to their models has sparked debate about whether and how increasingly capable AI models should be shared. Open sourcing in AI typically refers to making model architecture and weights freely and publicly accessible for anyone to modify, study, build on, and use. This offers advantages such as enabling external oversight, accelerating progress, and decentralizing control over AI development and use. However, it also presents a growing potential for misuse and unintended consequences. This paper offers an examination of the risks and benefits of open sourcing highly capable foundation models. While open sourcing has historically provided substantial net benefits for most software and AI development processes, we argue that for some highly capable foundation models likely to be developed in the near future, open sourcing may pose sufficiently extreme risks to outweigh the benefits. In such a case, highly capable foundation models should not be open sourced, at least not initially. Alternative strategies, including non-open source model sharing options, are explored. The paper concludes with recommendations for developers, standard-setting bodies, and governments for establishing safe and responsible model sharing practices and preserving open source benefits where safe. Corresponding author, Elizabeth.Seger at governance.ai. Please cite as Seger, Drexler. Executive summary. Recent decisions by AI developers to open source foundation models have sparked debate over the prudence of open sourcing increasingly capable AI systems. Open sourcing in AI typically involves making model architecture and weights freely and publicly accessible for anyone to modify, study, build on, and use. On the one hand, this offers clear advantages including enabling external oversight, accelerating progress, and decentralizing AI control. On the other hand, it presents notable risks, such as allowing malicious actors to use AI models for harmful purposes without oversight and to disable model safeguards designed to prevent misuse. This paper attempts to clarify open source terminology and to offer a thorough analysis of risks and benefits from open sourcing AI. While open sourcing has, to date, provided substantial net benefits for most software and AI development processes, we argue that for some highly capable models likely to emerge in the near future, the risks of open sourcing may outweigh the benefits. There are three main factors underpinning this concern. 1. Highly capable models have the potential for extreme risks. Of primary concern is diffusion of dangerous AI capabilities that could pose extreme risks, risk of significant physical harm or disruption to key societal functions. Malicious actors might apply highly capable systems, for instance, to help build new biological and chemical weapons, or to mount cyber attacks against critical infrastructures and institutions. We also consider other risks such as models helping malicious actors disseminate targeted misinformation at scale or to enact coercive population surveillance. Arguably, current AI capabilities do not yet surpass a critical threshold of capability for the most extreme risks. However, we are already seeing nascent dangerous capabilities emerge, and this trend is likely to continue as models become increasingly capable and it becomes easier and requires less expertise and compute resources for users to deploy and fine-tune these models. Section 3. 2. Open sourcing is helpful in addressing some risks, but could, overall, exacerbate the extreme risks that highly capable AI models may pose. For traditional software, open sourcing facilitates defensive activities to guard against misuse more so than it facilitates offensive misuse by malicious actors. However, the offense-defense balance is likely to skew more towards offense for increasingly capable foundation models for a variety of reasons including open sourcing allows malicious actors to disable safeguards against misuse and to possibly introduce new dangerous capabilities via fine-tuning. 2. Open sourcing greatly increases attacker knowledge of possible exploits beyond what they would have been able to easily discover otherwise. 3. Researching safety vulnerabilities is comparatively time-consuming and resource-intensive, and fixes are often neither straightforward nor easily implemented. 4. It is more difficult to ensure improvements are implemented downstream, and flaws and safety issues are likely to perpetuate further due to the general use nature of the foundation models. Section 3. 3. There are alternative, less risky methods for pursuing open source goals. There are a variety of strategies that might be employed to work towards the same goals as open sourcing for highly capable foundation models but with less risk, albeit with their own shortcomings. These alternative methods include more structured model access options catered to specific research, auditing, and downstream development needs, as well as proactive efforts to organize secure collaborations, and to encourage and enable wider involvement in AI development, evaluation, and governance processes. Section 4. In light of these potential risks, limitations, and alternatives, we offer the following recommendations for developers, standard-setting bodies, and governments. These recommendations are to help establish safe and responsible model sharing practices and to preserve open source benefits where safe. They also summarize the paper's main takeaways. Section 5. 1. Developers and governments should recognize that some highly capable models will be too risky to open source, at least initially. These models may become safe to open source in the future as societal resilience to AI risk increases and improved safety mechanisms are developed. 2. Decisions about open sourcing highly capable foundation models should be informed by rigorous risk assessments. In addition to evaluating models for dangerous capabilities and immediate misuse applications, risk assessments must consider how a model might be fine-tuned or otherwise amended to facilitate misuse. 3. Developers should consider alternatives to open source release that capture some of the same distributive, democratic, and societal benefits, without creating as much risk. Some promising alternatives include gradual or staged model release, structured model access for researchers and auditors, and democratic oversight of AI development and governance decisions. 4. Developers, standard-setting bodies, and open source communities should engage in collaborative and multi-stakeholder efforts to define fine-grained standards for when model components should be released. These standards should be based on an understanding of the risks posed by releasing different combinations of model components. 5. Governments should exercise oversight of open-source AI models and enforce safety measures when stakes are sufficiently high. AI developers may not voluntarily adopt risk assessment and model sharing standards. Governments will need to enforce such measures through options such as liability law and regulation, licensing requirements, fines, or penalties. They will also need to build the capacity to enforce such oversight mechanisms effectively. Immediate work is needed to evaluate the costs, consequences, and legal feasibility of various policy interventions and enforcement mechanisms we list. 3 risks of open-sourcing foundation models. Due to their vast application space and pace of development, foundation models have potential for broad and significant benefit and harm. Accordingly, open-sourcing these models poses some substantial risks which we present in 2 categories, malicious use, 3.1, and proliferation of unresolved flaws, 3.2. These harms are intensified by the fact that once a decision has been made to open source, there is no undo function. A published model cannot be rolled back if major safety issues emerge or if malicious actors find an AI tool to be particularly useful for scamming, hacking, deceptive influence, or acts of terror. Methods exist that allow even partially open-source models, e.g., code with some or no other model components, to be replicated and shared in full. Furthermore, we should expect model weight leaks to be frequent. Weights are contained in relatively small files, usually less than 256 gigabytes, that can be easily and untraceably shared. Meta, for instance, chose to restrict access to the weights of its large language model Llama to researchers on a case-by-case basis, but a week later the weights were leaked and are now available publicly on the internet. If weights for a trainable open-source model are leaked, the public functionally has access to a pre-trained open-source model. Note that if the model weights were not made publicly available, external actors who trained a trainable OS model may discover a set of model weights distinct from those discovered by the original developer who released the model. Using a different set of weights, however, does not preclude a model from performing equally well as, or perhaps even better than, a model using the original weights. Training frontier foundation models costs $10, $100 million in compute costs and is projected to increase to $1, $10 billion in coming years. However, the cost to train a model that matches the performance of a previous state-of-the-art system has fallen rapidly. For instance, training GPT-3, the most powerful foundation model available in June 2020, was estimated to cost at least $4.6 million, but by September 2022 an equivalently powerful model was theoretically available for $450,000. This is due to both advances in AI chip technology and the discovery of more efficient AI algorithms. Box 1. Further research is needed to define open-source gradients. Gradient of system access. The idea that models are either released open source or maintained closed source presents a false dichotomy. There are a variety of model release options ranging from fully closed to fully open model. Considerations and systems along the gradient of system access. What is generally referred to as open-source model release spans the 2 system access categories on the far right of Irene Salayman's gradient: downloadable, specifically non-gated downloadable, meaning that anyone is free to download the available components, and fully open. Gradient of open-source access. For fully open models, source code, weights, training data, and all other model components and available documentation are made public. However, in the non-gated downloadable category, in which some components are publicly downloadable, usually including weights and architecture, while others are withheld, there is room for further specification. Importantly, the precise benefits and risks of open sourcing are determined by the specific combinations of model components and documentation that are made publicly available. Precise definitions for precise standards. Near-term investment in a project is needed to investigate and articulate what activities are made possible by access to different combinations of model components. This information will be key to constructing effective and fine-grained model release standards that are not overly burdensome and to ensure open source values are protected and benefits enjoyed were safe. We make a start in Appendix A, though it is a much larger and more involved project than we can do justice here, and it is a project on which members of open source communities should be centrally involved. The Open Source Initiative recently launched one such initiative to define what machine learning systems will be characterized as open source. 3.1 Malicious use. Open source publication increases foundation models' vulnerability to misuse. Given access to the model's weights and architecture, any actor with the requisite technical background can write their own inference code, or modify available inference code, to run the model without safety filters. They can also fine-tune the model to enhance the model's dangerous capabilities or introduce new ones. There are several ways in which open source publication can facilitate misuse. Firstly, open sourcing a model allows actors to run the model using new or modified inference code that lacks any content safety filters included in the original code. Stable Diffusion's safety filter, for example, can be removed by deleting a single line of inference code. This is possible because such filters are implemented post hoc, appending additional processes to the model's inference code, rather than fundamentally changing the behavior of the model itself. With content safety filters removed, there is nothing to prevent users from presenting the models with unsafe requests or to prevent the model from yielding unsafe outputs. Secondly, the ability to fine-tune an open-source model without restrictions enables the modification of models specifically for malicious purposes. Fine-tuning that occurs through an API can be monitored. For example, the API owner can inspect the contents of the fine-tuning dataset. Without such monitoring, fine-tuning could involve the reintroduction of potentially dangerous capabilities that were initially removed by developers pre-release through their own fine-tuning. Fine-tuning can also lead models to become even more dangerous than they were before safety measures were applied. However, increasing a model's dangerous capabilities by fine-tuning would be more difficult than removing certain kinds of post-hoc safeguards like filters. Fine-tuning requires the curation of a dataset to promote those dangerous capabilities, as well as requiring the necessary compute and technical expertise to successfully fine-tune the model. Thirdly, access to model weights can aid adversarial actors in effectively jailbreaking system safeguards, including for copies of the system that have not been modified. Traditional jailbreaks use clever prompt engineering to override safety controls in order to elicit dangerous behavior from a model, e.g., getting a large language model, LLMs, to provide instructions for building a bomb by asking it to write a movie script in which one character describes how to build a bomb. Creative prompting only requires model query access. However, researchers recently discovered a method of adversarial attack in which the network weights of open-source LLMs aided researchers in optimizing the automatic and unlimited production of adversarial suffixes, sequences of characters that, when appended to a query, will reliably cause the model to obey commands even if it produces harmful content. Notably, this method, which was developed using open-source models Vicuna 7b and Meta's Llama 2, is transferable. It also works against other LLMs such as GPT-4, OpenAI, Bard, Google, and Claude, Anthropic, indicating that open-sourcing one model can expose the vulnerabilities of others. The above methods have the potential of reducing, if not entirely nullifying, the measures taken by developers to limit the misuse potential of their models. These measures would be much more difficult to bypass in cases where the model weights and training code are not openly released and where user interaction with the model is facilitated through an API. Fine-tuning, in particular, can also lead models to be more dangerous than they might have been originally. Knowledge equivalent to that from a graduate-level machine learning course would be sufficient to perform fine-tuning, but additional experience in training models would likely be useful in addressing the myriad of issues that sometimes come up, like divergence and memory issues. Depending on the malicious use case, it may be more or less difficult to source the required dataset. This observation comes from personal correspondence with several technical researchers. We do not provide further details on specific technical flaws since we believe it would be irresponsible to do so. Please see Rando et al. On red teaming the stable diffusion safety filter for related information. 3.1.1 Varieties of malicious use. Potential epistemic, social, and political consequences of foundation model misuse include the following. Influence operations. There is a wealth of existing research theorizing AI's utility in automating, or otherwise scaling, political or ideological influence campaigns through the production and targeted dissemination of false or misleading information. There's concern about multimodal foundation models being used to create interactive deepfakes of politicians or constructing and catering detailed and seemingly verifiable false histories. A recent experiment demonstrated the potential for AI-based influence operations when the LLM-based system, CounterCloud, was deployed to autonomously identify political articles, to generate and publish counter-narratives, and then to direct internet traffic by writing tweets and building fake journalist profiles to create a veneer of authenticity. Concerns about AI being used to manipulate public views, undermine trust, drive polarization, or otherwise shape community epistemics have led some scholars to speculate that whoever controls language models controls politics. Surveillance and population control. AI advances the means of states to monitor and control their populations through immersive data collection, such as facial and voice recognition, the nascent practice of effect recognition, and predictive policing. AI also allows automating and thus ever more cheaply analyzing unprecedented amounts of data. Authoritarian governments may be most likely to make use of AI to monitor and control their populations or to suppress subpopulations, but other types of governments are employing AI-enabled surveillance capabilities as well. Nascent AI surveillance technologies are spreading globally and in countries with political systems ranging from closed autocracies to advanced democracies. Scamming and spear phishing. Malicious actors can use AI to fraudulently pose as a trusted individual for the purpose of theft or extraction of sensitive information. For example, large language models have been shown to be proficient in generating convincing spear phishing emails, targeted at specific individuals, at negligible cost. Evidence from online forums also indicates that malicious AI tools and the use of jailbreaks to produce sensitive information and harmful content are proliferating amongst cybercriminals. High-profile scams using generative AI have also been observed, with one report detailing how $35 million was stolen from a Japanese firm by scammers who used AI voice cloning tools to pose as a company executive to employees. Cyber attacks. Foundation models have applications for both cybersecurity and cyber warfare. Early demonstrations show that LLM's current coding abilities can already find direct application in the development of malware and the design of cyber attacks. With improved accessibility and system capability, the pace of customized malware production may increase as could the variability of the malware generated. This poses a threat to the production of viable defense mechanisms. Especially in the near term, there is some evidence that AI-generated malware can evade current detection systems designed for less variable, human-written programs. Ultimately, information gained from cyber attacks might be used to steal identities, or to gather personal information used to mount more sophisticated and targeted influence operations and spear phishing attacks. Cyber attacks could also be used to target government agencies or critical infrastructure such as electrical grids, financial infrastructures, and weapons controls. Biological and chemical weapons development. Finally, current foundation models have shown nascent capabilities in aiding and automating scientific research, especially when augmented with external specialized tools and databases. Foundation models may therefore reduce the human expertise required to carry out dual-use scientific research, such as gain-of-function research in virology, or the synthesis of dangerous chemical compounds or biological pathogens. For example, pre-release model evaluation of GPT-4 showed that the model could re-engineer. To be clear, open sourcing is not to blame for the malicious use of AI. Foundation models are a dual-use technology, and where the technology is built by malicious actors or where effective safety restrictions are not in place for models accessible via API, misuse can occur. Open sourcing risks the diffusion of potentially dangerous capabilities to malicious actors and lowers barriers against misuse. Known harmful biochemical compounds, and red teaming on Anthropic's Claude 2 identified significant potential for biosecurity risks. Specialized AI tools used within these domains can also be easily modified for the purpose of designing potent novel toxins. Integrating narrow tools with a foundation model could increase risk further. During pre-deployment evaluation of GPT-4, a red teamer was able to use the language model to generate the chemical formula for a novel, unpatented molecule and order it to the red teamer's house. Lawmakers in the United States are beginning to take this biosecurity threat seriously. With bipartisan legislation, the Artificial Intelligence and Biosecurity Risk Assessment Act, being proposed that would monitor and study the potential threats of generative and open-source AI models being used intentionally or unintentionally to develop novel pathogens, viruses, bioweapons, or chemical weapons. 3.1.2 Ease of malicious use. One factor that potentially mitigates the misuse of open-source foundation models is that the pool of actors with the requisite talent and compute resources to download, run and, when necessary, modify highly capable models effectively is relatively small. Nevertheless, there are still several reasons to be concerned. First, there is an increasing number of individuals who have the skills to train, use, and fine-tune AI models as illustrated by growing computer science PhD enrollment as well as ballooning attendance at AI conferences. This is supplemented by an increasing number of tutorials and guides available online to use and fine-tune AI systems. Second, running a pre-trained AI model at a small scale requires only a small amount of compute, far less compute than training does. We estimate the largest Llama 2 model, Llama 2-70B, costs between $1.7 million and $3 per million to train, while the inference costs for Llama 2-70B are estimated to be between 0.2 and 6 cents per 750-word prompt and $4 per hour of GPU time. While the compute requirement becomes large when running models at a very large scale, that is, performing many inferences, large-scale runs may not be required for impactful misuses of a model. It is conceivable that only a few inferences may be needed in certain domains for models to be dangerous, e.g., a malicious actor may only need to find one critical vulnerability to disrupt critical infrastructure. Third, while the overall cost of training frontier models is increasing, algorithmic progress focuses heavily on reducing demands on compute resource, both for training and for fine-tuning. This, combined with the decreasing cost of compute, measured in flops per dollar, means that while initial model development and training may remain prohibitively expensive for many actors, we should not expect compute accessibility to always act as a strong limiting factor for. Meta reported using 1,720,320 A100 GPU hours to train Llama 2-70B. A single consumer A100 GPU can be rented privately for $1.99 hour, e.g. from RunPod. Our range assumes that Meta's cost was between $1 and $2 per hour. Since the Llama 2-70B model is about 129 gigabytes, it requires two 80 gigabytes A100 GPUs to store, each of which can be rented for about $2 hour, e.g. from RunPod. Both training and inference processes are typically more economical when run on centralized high-performance computing (HPC) systems optimized for AI workloads housed within data centers. While a single training run demands more compute than a single inference, the majority of compute for AI systems is not being used for training runs. As with most infrastructure, the operating costs will eventually be larger than the upfront cost. As the final product of AI systems, inferences are triggered by a multitude of daily actions, ranging from chatbot interactions and Google searches to commands to virtual personal assistants like Siri or Alexa. Consider image generation. The cumulative compute used for generating images via a generative AI model has now likely surpassed the initial training compute for the most popular generative systems by orders of magnitude. The key difference between development and deployment lies in time frame and independence. In inference, the computational resources can be distributed across multiple copies of the trained model across multiple compute infrastructures over a longer time duration. Whereas, in training, the computational resources are required over a smaller time frame within one closed system, usually one compute cluster. See footnote 9. For example, Meta's recently released IJEPA, Image Joint Embedding Predictive Architecture, offers a non-generative approach for self-supervised learning that does not rely on handcrafted data augmentations. It requires significantly fewer GPU hours to train for a better performing model. Fine-tuning existing open-source foundation models. Targeted fine-tuning of a pre-trained model to create dangerous models would remain much less expensive than building a model from scratch. 3.1.3 Offense-defense balance. Another argument against the threat of malicious use posed by open sourcing is that while open sourcing may increase model vulnerability to exploitation by malicious actors, it does more to help developers identify those vulnerabilities before malicious actors do and to support development of tools to guard against model exploitation and harms. In other words, in the offense-defense balance, a term referring to the relative ease of carrying out and defending against attacks, it has been argued that open sourcing favors defense. This is often true in the context of software development. Open sourcing software and disclosing software vulnerabilities often facilitate defensive activities more than they empower malicious actors to offensively identify and exploit system vulnerabilities. However, the same might not be safely assumed for open source AI, especially for larger and more highly capable models. Chevlain and Defoe explain that when a given publication, e.g., publication of software, AI models, or of research in biology or nuclear physics, etc., is potentially helpful for both people seeking to misuse a technology and those seeking to prevent misuse, whether offensive or defensive activities are favored depends on several factors. Counterfactual possession. How likely would a would-be attacker or defender be able to acquire the relevant knowledge without publication? If counterfactual possession by the attacker or defender is probable, then the impact of publication on their respective offensive and defensive activities is less. Absorption and application capacity. A publication only benefits attackers and defenders to the extent that they can absorb and apply the knowledge toward their desired ends. This depends on how much knowledge is disclosed, how the knowledge is presented, and the attentiveness and comprehension of the recipients. Resources for solution finding. For defenders, given publication, how many additional actors will help develop defenses? Impact of publication is greater if many people are likely to contribute to defensive applications. Availability of effective solutions. Are vulnerability patches easy to implement, or will developing solutions be a more complicated and time-intensive endeavor? The positive effects of publication decrease the more difficult vulnerabilities are to address. Difficulty cost of propagating solutions. Even where defensive solutions exist, if they are difficult to propagate, then the impact is less. For software development, the offense-defense balance of open-source publication often comes out in favor of defense. Software vulnerabilities are easy to find, so counterfactual possession by attackers is likely, and software patches are relatively easy to make, usually fully resolve the vulnerability, and are easily rolled out through automatic updates. However, in the context of AI research, Chevlain and Defoe offer the tentative conclusion that as AI models grow in capability and complexity, open-source publication will likely skew the balance towards offense. As discussed at the start of this section, attacker knowledge of vulnerabilities and their ability to exploit those vulnerabilities is greatly increased by open-source publication. For some vulnerabilities, researching solutions is time-consuming and resource-intensive, see section 4.2. Solutions developed also tend not to be perfect fixes. This is for a variety of reasons. Given our current lack of understanding of how advanced AI systems work internally, it may be difficult to identify the source of risk or failure. 2. Certain risks, such as bias and discrimination, may be learned from the training data. And it could be impossible to remove all bias from training data. 3. Reducing misuse of AI systems may require changes to social systems beyond changes to technical ones. 4. The structure of AI systems introduces new sources of failure specific to AI that are resistant to quick fixes, e.g., the stochastic nature of large language models may make it difficult to eliminate all negative outputs, and the inability to distinguish prompt injections from regular inputs may make it difficult to defend against such attacks. Finally, it is difficult to ensure. Improvements to open source models are implemented by downstream users and developers, which can result in widespread proliferation of unresolved model flaws. We address this topic in section 3.2. The conclusion that the offense-defense balance skews towards offense when open sourcing AI remains tentative because the offense-defense balance is influenced by a myriad of factors, making it difficult to reliably predict outcomes. The balance will vary with each model, application space, and combination of released model components. In addition, we may develop measures in the future that build our defensive capabilities. Nonetheless, the general notion holds: open sourcing AI leans towards offense more so than open sourcing software. AI developers should therefore think critically about the potential for, and potential protections against, misuse before every model release decision. 3.2 Risks from the proliferation of unresolved model flaws. Excitement about foundation models stems from a large number of potential downstream capability modifications and applications. These can include applications involving malicious intent and misuse, but more frequently will involve well-intentioned commercial, scientific, and personal applications of foundation models. If they have the necessary resources and model access, via open source or sufficient API access, downstream individuals, AI labs, and other industry and government actors can 1. Employ foundation models to new tasks that were not previously subject to risk assessments due to the general capabilities of these models. 2. Fine-tune or otherwise alter open-sourced foundation models to enable specialized or additional, narrow and general, capabilities. 3. Combine foundation models with other AI models, tools, and services, such as the internet or other APIs, to create a system of AI models which can have new narrow and general capabilities. For example, AutoGPT is an open-source app that integrates with GPT-3, 5 and GPT-4. While GPT 3.5 and GPT-4 can respond one prompt at a time, AutoGPT handles follow-ups to an initial prompt. This allows users to ask AutoGPT autonomously to complete higher-level goals that require iteratively responding to and generating new prompts. In all three cases, the risks, flaws, system vulnerabilities, and unresolved safety issues of the initial foundation model propagate downstream. For instance, biased and discriminatory behavior, vulnerabilities to prompt injection and adversarial attacks, autonomous self-proliferation abilities, or other dangerous capabilities could quickly proliferate if not caught and fixed before being integrated into downstream products and applications. The fact that the models can be applied to new contexts, 1, but also adapted, 2 and 3, to unlock new narrow and general capabilities, also means that further, difficult to predict risks and harms could emerge. Consequently, it is not certain that the safeguards put in place by the foundation model developer will continue to be effective if downstream developers fine-tune, alter, and combine AI models. This means that not only will existing model flaws proliferate, but previously fixed flaws and new flaws may also arise. If 1, 2, and 3 are enabled via structured API access, e.g., OpenAI's DaVinci 002 and GPT 3.5 can be fine-tuned via API, then developer monitoring of API use may go some way towards mitigating the proliferation harms described above. There is no such recourse, however, if a model is made open source. Once a model is open sourced, there are no takebacks if harms ensue. When risks and vulnerabilities are proliferated, there is no way of ensuring that when a fix is rolled out, assuming a fix is possible, see end of 3.1, that it is adopted or integrated effectively by downstream AI developers and users. Even in the context of traditional open-source software, software flaws are proliferated as downstream developers and users more often than not fail to implement. For example, ChemCrow is a large language model that integrates 17 expert-designed computational chemistry tools to accomplish tasks across organic synthesis, drug discovery, and materials design. The developers note that ChemCrow aids expert chemists and lowers barriers for non-experts, which can foster scientific advancement but could also pose significant risk of misuse. Also see Boyko, McKnight, and Gomez on combining large language models. Patches and version updates, even where the open-source license requires they do so. Very often consumers are unaware that their systems are running on out-of-date software or that vulnerability patches are available. Other times an updated software version will not integrate well with other software packages and existing infrastructure. We should expect the same challenges to undermine the maintenance of open-source foundation models, though a given foundation model will likely be applied to a much wider range of applications than a piece of software. There are also different incentives influencing decisions to implement updates for traditional software than for foundation models. For traditional software, patches and version updates improve system performance and functionality and resolve vulnerabilities that could cause harm to the user. It is to the user's benefit to implement software updates when feasible. In comparison, for increasingly capable foundation models, safety patches and updates often aim to reduce system functionality, disallowing certain activities that were possible with previous versions. If downstream developers and users wish to retain those functionalities, e.g., to be able to produce nude art with an image generator, they are incentivized not to update versions and, in some cases, not to disclose the existence of potential risks and system vulnerabilities. Due to the potential of proliferating risks and model flaws from highly capable foundation models, developers need to consider model release decisions carefully. Developers of highly capable foundation models must be cognizant of the potential downstream harms of their models, harms which they would be powerless to backtrack, and carefully consider alternative methods by which open-source benefits might be pursued but at significantly less risk. We discuss alternatives further in Section 4. Clear legislation is also needed to hold developers and controllers of AI systems liable for the impacts of their systems. For benefits of open-sourcing foundation models and alternative methods for achieving them. In this section we analyze 3 key benefits of open-source software: facilitating external evaluation, 4.1, accelerating beneficial progress, 4.2, and distributing control over technological. Five recommendations. We conclude this paper with 5 high-level recommendations for AI developers, standard-setting bodies, and governments for working towards safe and responsible model sharing decisions. These recommendations are necessarily incomplete and preliminary because best practices for open sourcing highly capable models will be highly context-dependent and require input from numerous parties. We look forward to further development of these recommendations in future work. Table 5 summarizes the recommendations. Each recommendation is explained in more detail below. Table 5, Recommendations for working towards responsible model sharing. 1. Developers and governments should recognize that some highly capable models will be too risky to open source, at least initially. These models may become safe to open source in the future as societal resilience to AI risk increases and improved safety mechanisms are developed. 2. Decisions about open sourcing highly capable foundation models should be informed by rigorous risk assessments. In addition to evaluating models for dangerous capabilities and immediate misuse applications, risk assessments must consider how a model might be fine-tuned or otherwise amended to facilitate misuse. 3. Developers should consider alternatives to open source release that capture some of the same benefits, without creating as much risk. Some promising alternatives include gradual or staged model release, model access for researchers and auditors, and democratic oversight of AI development and governance decisions. 4. Developers, standards-setting bodies, and open source communities should engage in collaborative and multi-stakeholder efforts to define fine-grained standards for when model components should be released. These standards should be based on an understanding of the risks posed by releasing different combinations of model components. 5. Government should exercise oversight of open source AI models and enforce safety measures when stakes are sufficiently high. AI developers may not voluntarily adopt risk assessment and model sharing standards. Governments will need to enforce such measures through options such as liability law and regulation, e.g. via licensing requirements, fines, or penalties. Governments will also need to build the capacity to enforce such oversight mechanisms effectively. 1. Developers and governments should recognize that some highly capable models will be too dangerous to open source, at least initially. If models are determined to pose significant threats, and those risks are determined to outweigh the potential benefits of open sourcing, then those models should not be open sourced. Such models may include those that can materially assist development of biological and chemical weapons, enable successful cyber attacks against critical national infrastructure, or facilitate highly effective manipulation and persuasion. This is not to say that a given highly capable model should never be open sourced. Expected model impacts are likely to change with increasing societal resilience and development of new defensive techniques. However, model developers should consider a default policy of pursuing release through alternative methods rather than open source if they find that a model poses significant threats, and that the benefits of open sourcing do not outweigh the risks of doing so. 2. Decisions about open sourcing highly capable foundation models should be informed by rigorous risk assessments. In the past, the benefits of open sourcing seem to have clearly outweighed the risks. However, we are not confident that this will continue to be the case in the future for highly capable foundation models, Section 3. It is therefore important to carefully assess potential risks and benefits before open sourcing the model, especially since the decision to open source a model is irreversible. The need to conduct risk assessments prior to model release seems to be generally accepted. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, provides guidance for how to conduct such an assessment which might be applied to inform open sourcing decisions. Some scholars have suggested ways in which the NIST AI risk management framework could be adapted to general-purpose AI systems and catastrophic risks. In the future, we think that developers of highly capable foundation models will need to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches. They may need to conduct deterministic safety assessment as well as probabilistic risk assessments, as is common in the nuclear industry. Since risks associated with certain model capabilities are particularly concerning, risk assessments should be informed by evaluations of dangerous model capabilities. Both internal and external model evaluations should be conducted. External assessments can take many different shapes, such as model evaluations, model audits, red teaming, or researcher access via API. Developers intending to open source a model that is likely to be highly capable should conduct more involved risk assessments than they would have otherwise. Firstly, the risk assessment should be more thorough to have the decision be as well informed as possible, given the irreversibility of decisions to open source. Methods such as additional red teaming, internal testing, and staged release approaches should be pursued. Secondly, risk assessments ahead of open sourcing decisions need to assess how the model can be amended to facilitate misuse. The risk assessment must consider the ease with which safeguards can be removed and uncensored versions of the model can be distributed. Often, safeguards will be so easy to remove that it is better to avoid the model having the worrying capability altogether, Section 3. For example, while Stable Diffusion 1.0 had a safety filter, it was easy to disable. In future releases, Stability AI therefore opted to remove inappropriate content from the training data instead. Risk assessments should also consider the extent to which risks can be exacerbated by malicious actors fine-tuning or otherwise amending the model to elicit or develop more dangerous capabilities, Section 3. It is difficult to anticipate how the model is going to be fine-tuned. It is therefore crucial that red teamers have fine-tuning access to the model ahead of release. Note that we do not claim that existing models are already too risky. We also do not make any predictions about how risky the next generation of models will be. Our claim is that developers need to assess the risks and be willing to not open source a model if the risks outweigh the benefits. Thirdly, risk assessments should consider factors external to the model. The social impacts of a model, e.g., on democratic processes, are difficult to forecast and necessitate consideration of how the model will interact with other tools and outside institutions, cultures, and material conditions. Finally, for red teaming, model evaluations, and other external safety assessments to be effective, AI developers need to elicit participation from a diverse and comprehensive set of experts. Only by harnessing a varied set of viewpoints and expertise can we ensure a broad spectrum of potential risks are adequately identified and evaluated. 3. Developers should consider alternatives to open source release as possibilities for working towards distributive, democratic, and societal advancement goals with less risk. Before open sourcing a highly capable foundation model, developers should first clarify goals, reflecting on why specifically they want to open source a model, and then consider alternatives that may reach those goals at lower risk. With respect to alternative model sharing strategies, some options may offer some of the same benefits as open sourcing, but unlike open sourcing, still allow developers to adjust their deployment strategy after release. The idea that models are either fully open or fully closed is a false dichotomy. As discussed in Section 4, there are numerous options for gated, API, or hosted access in between which allow for varying degrees of model probing and researchability, and there are proposed frameworks to help navigate these options. Developers could also deploy the model in stages, staged release, and gather observational data about how a model is likely to be used and modified if open-sourced, Section 4.1.3. Finally, developers could employ proactive efforts to pursue desired benefits, such as by implementing democratic processes to distribute influence over development and release decisions, Section 4.3.3. 4. A collaborative and multi-stakeholder effort is needed to define fine-grained standards for when model components should be released. Standard-setting organizations or industry bodies should develop model-sharing standards that provide guidance relating to decisions about whether, and if so how, to open-source highly capable foundation models. Such a standard would contribute to more consistent industry practices and could be an important step towards regulation. There are a wide range of model-sharing options, even within the currently ill-defined category of open-source systems, see Box 1. Model-sharing standards should both support safe model distribution and protect open-source practices and benefits. To achieve both, these standards must be fine-grained and built on a well-researched understanding of the extent to which access to different combinations of model components enable unrestricted model use, reproduction, and modification. We make a start at breaking down and defining the numerous model components that can be independently shared in Appendix A. It is, however, a much larger project than we can do justice to here, and it is a project on which members of open-source communities should be centrally involved. A clear understanding of activities enabled by access to various model components can then be used to inform model-sharing standards that are well-tailored to their purpose, that are not overly burdensome, that prevent distribution of dangerous capabilities, and that do not unnecessarily undermine open-source benefits. Technical experts, open-source communities, policymakers, and civil society all need to be involved in this process. There are several actors who could develop such standards. Although standard-setting organizations like NIST and ISO IEC have published standards for AI, they do not seem to have engaged with questions around open-sourcing foundation models specifically. The Partnership on AI, PAI, has a working group on foundation models, and they have published similar guidelines for publishing research in the past. The Open Source Initiative recently started a working group to define what makes an AI system open source. Another body that could contribute industry expertise is the recently announced Frontier Model Forum. However, current participants have generally not open-sourced their most advanced foundation models. 5. Government should exercise oversight and enforcement where stakes are sufficiently high. AI developers may not voluntarily adopt the risk assessment and model sharing standards described above, and government involvement will likely be needed. Without such involvement, developers may not be sufficiently incentivized to voluntarily conduct thorough risk assessments ahead of model release, to appropriately act on those results, to provide sufficient external access to their models, or put in place appropriate safeguards. For instance, AI developers may preferentially choose friendly external assessors who share similar concerns around certain types of risk or whose financial incentives undermine their ability to provide an independent assessment. To mitigate such potentialities, governments should increase oversight capacity and set up mechanisms for enforcing rigorous risk assessments and responsible model release in sufficiently high-stakes contexts. Governments need to ensure that oversight is rigorous and independent, supported by a diverse and comprehensive set of independent advisors, and investigates a wide range of AI risks. Similarly, enforcement mechanisms need to guard against the risk of regulatory capture. There are multiple options governments could consider in terms of enforcement, such as liability. Developers could be held liable for harms caused by their models that could have been reasonably foreseen or avoided through an exercise of due care. While courts will ultimately have to decide liability on a case-by-case basis, there are strong incentives for developers to demonstrate due care by, for example, conducting thorough risk assessments and model evaluations, implementing adequate precautionary measures, refraining from or reducing high-risk activity, and maintaining their ability to limit harms that occur post-release. Existing tort law already covers unjustifiably risky acts and omissions, via negligence for failing to exercise due care, including to prevent foreseeable criminal conduct by third parties, products liability for defective designs, and strict liability for abnormally dangerous activities. A critical task will be to clarify the application of these doctrines to open-sourcing highly capable foundation models. Where the application of existing liability regimes fails to address significant risks, new statutory duties and liability laws may need to be developed. Regulation. Governments could legally require developers of highly capable foundation models to conduct pre-deployment risk assessments, report potentially dangerous capabilities discovered during model evaluation, and provide model access pre-deployment to government auditors. Regulations may also specify under which conditions models may be open-sourced. They could also encourage or mandate that significant model deployments are preceded by notifications to relevant parts of government. Such requirements could be enforced by administrative enforcement measures, both before model deployments, e.g., via a licensing regime, as well as after, e.g., via fines and penalties. It is worth noting that liability and regulation each have their strengths and weaknesses. While liability is generally less onerous and more flexible, enforcing liability rules might be difficult, e.g., because of causation and attribution problems, especially when a malicious actor intervenes, and it is not possible to enforce liability rules ahead of model deployments. Regulation is the only way to enforce compliance before a model is open-sourced. However, regulation typically leads to higher compliance costs, and there are risks of regulatory capture. In general, liability should be seen as a C4, duty, and 6, tortious conduct, 1965, and 901 on the general principle of liability, 1979, C on products liability. C on the legal concept of negligence. CC 302AB, 1965, Restatement, 3rd, of Torts, General Principles 17, Discussion Draft April 5, 1999, the conduct of a defendant can lack reasonable care insofar as it can foreseeably combine with or bring about the improper conduct of a third party, c. e.g., Hamilton v. Accutech, 62F, Sup. 2D 802, 825, EDNY 1999, 222F, 3D 36, 2D CIR 2000, 95N.Y.2D. 878, New York 2000, holding that gun manufacturers had a duty to take reasonable steps available to reduce the possibility that fall into the hands of those likely to misuse them and thus could be held legally responsible under New York negligence law for criminal shootings resulting from failures to minimize the risk through their distribution and marketing. Choices. C520, 1977. Complement to, rather than a substitute for, regulation. Since the right mix of policies will be highly context-specific, we do not make any further recommendations. Policy interventions on open sourcing are delicate because of the obvious benefits of open sourcing and because for-profit companies might use safety concerns as an excuse to gain a competitive advantage. These concerns should be taken seriously, and further research is needed to understand the risks, benefits, and legal feasibility of different policy options. However, policy interventions still seem necessary because open sourcing highly capable foundation models might essentially democratize the ability to cause significant harm and because the decision to open source a model is irreversible. We think the current debate around the issue is healthy and necessary to strike the right balance between open source risks and benefits. In this paper, we have advocated for a risk-based approach that could be summarized as make open source decisions with care. 6. Conclusion. Open sourcing offers clear advantages including enabling external oversight, accelerating progress, and decentralizing control over a potentially transformative technology. To date, open source practice has provided substantial net benefits for most software and AI development processes, distributing influence over the direction of technological innovation and facilitating the development of products well-tailored to diverse user needs. However, as AI research progresses and capabilities improve, open sourcing also presents a growing potential for misuse and unintended consequences. Open sourcing increases the risk of proliferation of model flaws downstream. With access to model weights and code, malicious actors can also more easily bypass safety measures and modify models or fine-tune models to display dangerous capabilities. Some of the most worrying potentialities involve the use of highly capable foundation models to build new biological and chemical weapons, to mount cyber attacks against critical infrastructures and institutions, and to execute highly effective political influence operations. For some highly capable foundation models, these risks may come to outweigh open source benefits. In such cases, developers and regulators should acknowledge that the model should not be open sourced, at least initially. These models may become safe to open source in the future as societal resilience to AI risk increases and improved safety mechanisms are developed. Model release decisions should therefore be responsive to comprehensive risk assessments and a fine-grained understanding of what activities are enabled by freely sharing different combinations of model components. These decisions should also take into account how alternative model sharing options, e.g. staged release, gated access, and research API, might further some of the same goals as open sourcing. Alternative proactive measures to organize secure collaborations, and to encourage and enable wider involvement in AI development, evaluation, and governance processes might also be employed. Open sourcing is but one option for sharing models, and model sharing is but one mechanism for facilitating wider community contributions to AI evaluation, development, and control. Overall, openness, transparency, accessibility, and wider community input are key to facilitating a future for beneficial AI. The goal of this paper is therefore not to argue that foundation model development should be kept behind closed doors. Model sharing, including open sourcing, remains a valuable practice in most cases. Rather, we submit that decisions to open source increasingly capable models must be considered with great care. Comprehensive risk assessments and careful consideration of alternative methods for pursuing open source objectives are minimum first steps. References.